Hola. Hello. Today we're going to talk about chapter 5 of Laudato Si, the encyclical of Pope Francis, and its title is The Lines of Approach and Action. Now, definitely here in chapter 5, we're moving into what we call the action step. See, judge, act. You know? We've seen the problem, tried to judge it morally, ethically, and now we're going to move into what do we do about it? How do we accomplish these things we've been talking about? You know, a healthy environment, a quality of life for the majority of the planet, or the common good, no? And in one word, the essence to it all, in Francis's mind, I think, would be an open dialogue, where the church is one of the voices, and all the peoples, no one's excluded, including the majority of the planet who are the poor, no? This has been going on since 1950. He says there is a growing conviction that the planet is our homeland. For that reason, the subtitle of the encyclical is The Care of Our Common Home. No, one home in one family in one home. No, there are, as we have pointed out, negative effects of the models that we have presently of production, consumption, but there also is a whole movement, what we might call a global movement, or a global perspective to this problem. Certainly Pope Francis is looking at this, I said at the beginning, from the bottom up, from the third world, which is different than what most of us perhaps perceive or maybe have a hard time understanding. But he's looking at one world and everyone and everybody in it. He says that. I direct this encyclical to every living person on the planet, no? And so we need a common plan. We need to come together. It is happening. It is slow, but there's a growing consensus, he says, a global consensus. All over the world, people are starting to talk about this problem and how we go about working together to solve it. No? There are world summits going on. No? The last one that we're most familiar with is Paris, 2015, where 195 countries, almost every country on the planet, signed on to lower their carbon emissions. No? And the Catholic Climate Covenant that I work with recently put out a declaration, because our country pulled out of that, saying that Catholics are still in. They're joining a whole host of cities and mayors and governors, university presidents, bishops. Our diocese just recently signed on to that declaration that Catholics are still in the Paris Agreement. In other words, we're still trying to lower these carbon emissions. No? And basically, the basic problem has to do with the fossil fuels, no? Gas, petroleum. I just mentioned that the present administration wants to bail out and keep the coal and the nuclear plants going, which is kind of the contrary to what some of us are working on or trying to do. No, and then the flip side of the global environmental problem is the global inequality. He joins those two together. They're inseparable, as it were, no? But a lot is happening. The challenge to us right now with this fossil fuel and sustainable energy is being able to capture and to store energy. Yesterday I was at an event, and I was talking with two different people from two different parishes, one nearby here, St. Pius X. They're at zero cost for their electrical needs. Our Lady of Confidence has got back $108 last month. In other words, they produced more than they used because of their solar energy. So there is a lot going on. At the same time, there's what Pope Francis called the globalization of indifference. In other words, there's a lack of consciousness, a lack of political will, he calls it. You know? But at the same time, and what this chapter is mentioning is the lines of approach to action. There's an ecological movement that's taking over around the world. It started all the way back in 1972 in the Stockholm Declaration that it's 46 years ago, no? And it said that those who cause the problem should also sustain the cost of cleaning it up or solving the problem. And they stated the goal of limiting the greenhouse gas emissions. That was way back in 1972. 20 years later, in Rio de Janeiro, They said the principal cause, as Francis says in the encyclical, is human activity. It's what we're doing that's causing this problem. The bishops of Bolivia spoke out, and they said that the industrialized nations have a greater responsibility for cleaning up this problem. There were other conventions, the Basel Commission. They were onto reporting and controlling these emissions. Vienna Conference talked about the ozone layer. That's the greenhouse gas effect, the trapping of the gases which causes the global warming. The UN, United Nations, has their letter to the world, the charter, the Earth Charter, and they have 17 principles that they stated. It goes back to the year 2012, no? And sometimes they say that national interests take precedence over the common good, no? Poor countries. This came up big in Paris. The poor countries are concerned about eliminating poverty, of course. And they're trying to reach out and say, you who are industrialized, who are benefiting from this, should help us. Not only with subsidies, that helps, but also sharing technological advances, no? Technological assistance. And Pope Francis says at the base level, these are ethical decisions. They're moral decisions, no? And it has to do with our lifestyles. It has to do with what Patriarch Bartholomew called not just giving up, but learning to give, to share. That has to do with our values, and it has to do with our attitudes, no? So there is the idea of solidarity, and there's the idea of developing these norms, or what we called in the previous chapter regulations, so that the problems don't happen. Moving on just a little bit to the oceans. This is a big part of our planet. 70% of the surface of the planet is water, no? So what happens in there, we don't see it, so we're not necessarily aware of it. But there is a growing concern about marine waste, doing the heating of the water and the acidification of the water, but also the use and the disposal of plastics and styrofoams into the oceans, which pollutes the ocean, but it also gets into the food chain of the fish, which is not good for them. And there's a mindset, and we struggle against this. It's the profit motive versus the common good, if you want to say it in a few words. But it opposes the struggle against this global warming, which is driven by profit, and it also struggles against or opposes the elimination of poverty to a certain extent. It might in essence say yes to it, but the measures to bring it about, it would not. And as Pope Francis equates these two, the environment and poverty are two sides of the same coin. You can't talk about one without talking about the other. I was struck by that my first time I read through the encyclical. I was saying, why does he always keep bringing up the poor, the poor, the poor? And finally he said it, they're the majority of the planet. They asked him recently, they said, Your Holiness, who is the poorest on the planet? And he said, the poorest is Mother Earth, which was very unexpected by everyone, no? All the way back to the 1960s. Blessed John the 23rd. His concern was for a need for a true world political order. And this throws fear into some people. What he's talking about is an authoritative source that can try to bring controls over human activity. And of course that needs to be balanced, but it's also fought against. The crux of this whole thing is trying to enforce the common good versus protecting individual rights, or we would say the individual and economic and political interests, which we might say are self-interest sometimes. And even we just said a minute ago, the international or entities sometimes have more power than nation states, no? But we're talking here about, again, the common good and these regulations. It's another way of putting it is there's a struggle between the short-term growth and long-range environmental agendas. It's hard to balance out those two, you know? And power politics takes over. There's too much money. If you follow the money, you get to the heart of the power. And of course, that's looking for jobs, we call it, but it's also looking for profit, you know? And it's all good within balance, but it's like the food chain in the environment. It's perhaps out of balance. And we try to move towards the common good. Pope Francis suggests cooperatives. Why does he suggest them? When I read that, I thought, why? It's almost a dying system. Well, the system itself of cooperatives is that there are local individuals who control their production, and they share equally, almost equally, the results, the product of their work. No? It's citizens containing, as it were, political power. And he says, unless citizens contain political power, national, regional, and municipal, it will not be possible to contain the damage to the environment. This is moving into another aspect of this whole problem. The people's involvement, the conscious level of people, and there is hope here. Francis went to Bolivia, and he talked to the NGOs, I call them. They're the poor people's organization, or the popular movements. When he got done with his talk, he looked at them and he said, you people have the power. They looked at each other like, we have power? He's meaning you people form conscience of the masses, of the people. Here in San Diego, I went to listen to a scientist, eminent scientist. He's a Hindu from India by the name of Dr. Ramanathan. He talked to an ecumenical group of pastors. And when he got done, he looked at us and he said, you people have the power. Again, we're thinking, we have power? How do we have power? He said, you form the conscience. So I say to you, everybody that's listening to this, you have the power, because you have something to do with forming the conscience level of the people. No? I'm working with people called creation care teams. They're very small, but don't forget what the anthropologist Margaret Mead said. Don't think your small group can do nothing. It's the only group that ever has. No? So we're moving into this thing about community organization, development of a common conscience level. No? And unless there is a certain amount of that pressure from the upwards movement, from the people, so to speak, politicians are a little bit reluctant to act. The story, I think I might have mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt. He received a commission one day about a particular problem. They went in, they talked long and strong, and when they got done, he looked at him and he said, all right, you've convinced me. Now go out and bring power, bring pressure on me. There's a lot of wisdom in that. And that's what we're talking about, the power of the people. What do we say? The people united have never been defeated. Well, there's some truth in that as well, no? So a healthy politics, which our Constitution says, is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. In other words, power to the people, no? And unless that exists, these changes perhaps will not come about. So we're looking at here at an evaluation of the environmental impact. And that should always be done. We know that before a construction site or before a development site is to take place, there is what they call an environmental study to see how this is going to affect the quality of life, and not just the human life, but also all the other parts of the biodiversity that surround that area. No? It's an ethical principle, and that is in contrast with the values of consumerism, which is looking for profit. We hear that all the time about the new developments, the housing developments here in San Diego. Is it ethical? Is it for the common good? Is it for the quality of life of the people? Or is it more driven by the profit motive? No? This, in a way, is our mission, to try to bring that to the table, that voice of the people, that voice of the common good, that voice of the quality of human life, or if you want to call it the moral, ethical voice, which many times is left out of the equation. No? We mentioned the problem of water. Water for many people. Water is necessary for life. Where there's life, there's water. If they find water on Mars, they think life is possible there. No? Water is life. A sixth grader, when she made her poster, said. No? And I said before, 70% of the Earth's surface is water. No? Of that 70%, only 3% is portable or drinkable. No? And of that 3% of drinkable or usable water, 70% of it goes to agriculture, 20% of it goes to industry, and only 10% of it goes to human development. No, so we're talking here about the problem and the importance of water. No, we have said before that if profit is the sole criterion, that the environment doesn't count. It's not taken into consideration. Now, the church's role in all of this is not to decide the political economic decisions, but it's to promote, encourage an honest and an open debate, a dialogue, and to take into consideration, we're aiming for the common good. That's ethics, that's morality, Now, right now, technology is the dominant paradigm that is driving pretty much the economy. And the economy drives politics. Who has money gets elected and serves the interests of those who elected him, of course, So it's that transition from the technology governing or dominating economy which dominates politics. What's missing from that picture? Again, it's the ethical, moral aspect that Pope Francis is arguing that we need to bring into this discussion, if you want to call it the voice of the people. The environment is one of those things that cannot be protected by the market forces, Profit alone, if that's the only motive, environment gets left out, okay? Now, there is what's called a sustainable use of natural resources, and people look at that, what am I talking about? Maybe sounds very negative. It isn't. It's good business. It's a good investment. Look at where jobs are being produced. Green jobs, the solar panels is perhaps the fastest growing sector in our economy. And as I said before, the scientists are challenged now to be able to capture and store what's been free from day one, wind and solar energy, and it's unjust that our behavior consumes and wastes and destroys as it is. That's what we call the inequality. I gave the example once, I think, of Oxfam, England, where 8 individuals own more wealth than 1/2 of the poorest people on the planet. And Francis says we should be indignant about that. Benedict XVI spoke out and said, the time has come to accept a decreased growth in some parts of the world. You will not hear that from politicians. They would not get elected by saying that. In other words, we should have a more sober lifestyle, he says. Again, that's a prophetic voice by Pope Benedict XVI, and now by Pope Francis, change our habits. That's a hard thing to tell people to do, to live a simpler life that others may simply live, we say, So the maximization of profits only is a misunderstanding of what the concept of economy. If economy is to try to lift everyone's quality of life, then profit cannot be the only consideration. Ethics must play a part. It's unethical to say that we look for profits and we do not cover the social costs. In other words, what we're destroying and wasting. The greater the power that a nation or group has, the greater their responsibility for the common good, or what we call the social cost. Economics without politics and ethics cannot be justified. John Fitzgerald Kennedy once said, the soul of a nation can be judged by how it treats the least among them. The Old Testament was bullish about that. Kings were judged by how they treated the widow, the orphan, and the foreigner. We'd say immigrant or refugee today. So we're challenged to rethink the whole process at a global level. And science alone can't do that. Francis is arguing for the religious voice, the religious language can be a help here. It's not the governing one, it doesn't make the decisions, but the values of our faith life and our morality, always speaking up for the vulnerable, the majority of the planet, the poor, and he's saying that believers must be challenged to live a way that's consonant with their faith and not just contradicted by their actions. We cannot believe one thing and then act differently or accept differently, passively. 80% of Americans are believers. And so if that is harnessed, if what Pope Francis said in Bolivia, what Ramanathan said to us, and what I just said to you a minute ago, you have power, and we begin to take that into consideration, that our voice counts. We're joining this ecological movement, and we're doing what Pope Francis calls lines of approach and action. What's an example of that? Well, climate change isn't just a Catholic problem. It's a human problem. It's a global problem. But at the local level, someone said, you think globally, you act locally. I'm becoming more and more aware of farmers markets, community gardens, schools. A guy called me yesterday. He wanted to be at our activity on June 16th, which is a teach-in on all of this. And he wants to set up a table because he goes to schools and he teaches gardening. He's a nonprofit. And he came to our Catholic schools and wanted to go in and teach gardening to the students. And our local politicians, here in San Diego, we have a climate plan for cleaning up the environment, and a climate action plan. EDCO and SDG&E have plans. They can educate and help. There are skeptics, but there also are scientists, the majority of them, who are saying this is true and we must do something about it. So what we're looking at here is joining together in solidarity and giving voice to the people, an ethical voice in favor of the common good, because we are one family living in one house. Okay? Thank you. That has to do with the lines of approach and action. And that's chapter 5.